A lot of people have urinary tract problems, and some of these are quite easy to treat, some of them are not so easy. I hope if you have an interest in this that you'll join us for this program, as we'll be talking about some of the very common ones, mainly in children, and we think that you will enjoy our program and how to treat these urinary tract problems.
The following program presents principles designed to promote good health and is not intended to take the place of personalized professional care. The opinions and ideas expressed are those of the speaker. Viewers are encouraged to draw their own conclusions about the information presented. Welcome to Help Yourself to Health with Dr. Agatha Thrash of UG Pines Institute. And now, here's your host, Dr. Thrash.
Children handle urinary tract problems quite well. I remember the first patient that I had with a urinary tract problem, a little fellow probably about 13 or 14 months old. He had been born with ureters that did not connect into the bladder in a proper way. So of course a very serious problem, and he had to be operated on. And as a part of the treatment, we used a cystostomy, which was going in just above the pubic bone and putting a hole in the bladder so that we could put a catheter in it, and that would enable him to pass his urine through this catheter. The little fellow seemed to always smell of urine, but that didn't seem to bother him at all. He was so happy in the hospital, and of course all the nurses and the doctors paid a little close attention to him. Especially he and I seemed to bond together really well, so anytime I walked on his ward, he would just hold his hands up for me to pick him up, so I would pick him up and put him on my hip, and he would walk with me around to do all of the rounds I had to do. And eventually the time came when we closed up the cystostomy, and we were going to send him home. So when he left, he smelled all fresh and clean, no more urine smell. He was very happy, and we were too, except sad to say goodbye. That young man is now well into his 40s, and he is doing quite well. He's never had any more urinary tract problems. His little connections function very nicely, and he is hale and hearty and very healthy. Now, we can start our urinary tract problems even before birth, or as in the case of many children, at the bed. While a lot of children are broken to the house by the age of 18 months, there are some who require a great deal longer than that. And I have here Dr. Don Miller, who is going to talk with you about bedwetting problems. That's a serious problem in some homes. What can you tell us about what to do for it and how it comes about?
Well, it is indeed a serious problem. You know, when we have a small animal like a dog, we usually put the little nose in it and we spank them. And I will say this, that spanking and punishing is not this cure for a child who's still bedwetting. About 4% of children still bedwet by the age of 12. And punishing will only make the matter worse. As a matter of fact, emotional causes are one of the things that precipitate the bedwetting. And so if a child is in a home where there's turmoil, where there is anger, where there is strife, that child may be more likely to be a bedwetter. And so we need to have peace in the home. And it's pretty uncommon nowadays to have that peace in the home, but we need to find the peace in the home. There are other causes for bedwetting. One could be just the child was born with a smaller bladder. Now, a good way to find out whether that's the problem is, does the child urinate frequently through the day? Basically, if they have a small bladder, it fills up, they've got a void. Fills up, they've got a void, and that can continue through the night. And so we have to make sure that the child, basically, as the evening starts wearing on, they quit drinking fluids. Really, no fluids after 5 p.m. in the afternoon. They should drink plenty during the rest of the day, but 5 p.m., quit the fluids, and then make sure that just before they go to bed, they void. It's purposefully, I don't need to go anyway. I remember in Marine Corps boot camp, even at that time, there were a couple of guys in my platoon that were bedwetters, and they would be made to go into the bathroom before they went to bed and void, and then twice during the night they were woken up by the fire watch and made to go in there. Even if they didn't have to go, they were made. That sort of separated out those who are doing it just to get out of the core or something, and because they didn't like getting woken up at night. But that sometimes can help. As a matter of fact, they've got a little device called a wee guard, some types of little alarms that are placed on the child, and when they start to get wet, they send an alarm that wakes the child up, and then they can go in and void, which is not a bad idea. But probably the main cause of bedwetting is food allergies. Some type of an allergy in their system, in their environment, that's causing them to have this problem. And it's interesting to note that usually if a parent has an allergy like hives or hay fever or other types of allergies, it's more likely that the child will have allergies, and then it can manifest itself in bedwetting. There are certain major foods that lead to bedwetting, and probably the number one food, which about 60% of children who bedwet after the age of 12 are allergic to, cow's milk. And I would say probably all dairy foods. And so that needs to be eliminated from the child's dietary. And there are some other things that they can be taking. Chocolate. Of course, if you take chocolate, you are taking milk. So it could be the chocolate, although there are things in the chocolate that irritate the bladder, which could cause you to urinate when you don't want to, but it's also the milk in there. Eggs and citrus. Wheat, grain, corn, chicken. Some of these are good foods, but if a child is sensitive, they need to stay away. And what we recommend is a child withdraw these things. I'm going to read this list slowly. If you have this problem in your home, write down these things and go on what we call an elimination diet. Take all these things away from them for a period of, a week or two, probably at least 2 weeks, and then add back the ones that are good. Okay, you can make that determination, but here's the list. Cow's milk, all dairy products. That means cheese, that means ice cream, that means milk, that means no matter high fat, low fat, any fat, no fat, whatever, none of that. Chocolate, eggs, citrus, wheat. Wheat is a major allergen, probably because it's one of the earliest foods that we introduce into the child, and because we don't properly cook our wheat products. And the next one is grains. We need to properly cook our grain products. Corn, chicken, meat, peanuts, and fish. So eliminate those from the dietary and see if that does not take care of the problem. If it does, or eliminate it from the diet. If that does take care of the problem, then you know what it is. Add one back, which might be a decent one. If the problem does not come back, you have found out what the problem was, and the child is cured of their problem. Constipation can also be a cause of bedwetting. Basically, a constipated bowel is pushing against the bladder, which causes it to not have as much volume and pushes out urine in the night. So a child should not be constipated. None of us should be constipated. Of course, we cure that by making sure the child drinks plenty of water during the day and has a high fiber diet and stays away from all those other things in the diet that can cause constipation, those highly refined carbohydrates and sugary junk foods. Have the child, when they are going to the bathroom urinating, have them do the start-stop thing. It's almost like the Kegel exercises. They start the stream and then consciously stop the stream. Start the stream, consciously stop the stream. That will set up a mental system in their minds that they are now under mental control. And even when you are asleep, you're under mental control of this particular problem. I have learned that if a child has been sick for a period of time and they are using a little hand urinal and they roll over in bed and urinate, that sometimes sends a signal to the brain that, okay, you don't have to get up, just do it while you're laying there. And that goes also for adults. If you are somehow bedridden, it could lead to a little bit of incontinence in the nighttime season later on. We've got to visibly or consciously get up out of the bed and go to the bathrooms, which is the best way. Outdoor exercise, extremely important for a child who has bedwetting problems. We find that children with bedwetting bedwet more in the wintertime when they're not quite as physically active than in the summertime. So exercise has a large amount to do with bedwetting problems. And then one thing, I've already mentioned it, that we did there in boot camp, but it's not a bad idea. If the child goes to bed at 8:30 at night, which is a good time for a child to go to bed, you might want to wake them at some specific time later on in the night and just wake them up, take them to the bathroom, and have them void then. Gets them into that pattern. It might eliminate them going into the problem. So these are some simple things that we can do for a child. Of course, there's other things that can lead to bedwetting, a urinary tract infection, which Dr. Thrash will be talking about, cystitis. But these are some simple things, Dr. Thrash, that I think might help a child.
Now, you mentioned long cooking of grains. Did you say enough to make it so that I would be able to know how to feed my child grains?
Okay. Not just the child, Dr. Thrash, but even feeding us the grains. We don't cook our grains well enough. A grain is a carbohydrate. A carbohydrate comes in a number of different forms. We have sugars, we have starches, we have fiber. It's the starches, which is nothing more than a long chain of glucose molecules. If it is not properly cooked or hydrolyzed, these chains do not break down, and these long chains can get into the blood and circulate through the system, and these long chains can cause real problems in the system. They can go into the brain and cause little lacunar scars, and everyone over 30 has a brain full of lacunar scars. They can go down to the kidneys and cause some type of problems there. It can go into the bones. They did an experiment. They fed a lactating woman a solution of starch suspended in water. She drank that, and within a short period of time, they found the starch chains in her blood, in her breast milk, in her urine, and so we need to cook our grains well. Now, what's cooking the grains well? Even instant oats should be cooked for a half hour to 45 minutes. I cook all of my oatmeal at night in a crock pot all night long. Rice, up to 2 to 3 hours. People say, well, how can you eat it like that? Well, you've got to make a choice. You're going to have the lacunar scars in your brain or a little bit more mushy food. But if you take your rice or your other grains and you dextrinize it first, put it in a hot skillet, heat it up until you hear it start to little sizzle, that will dextrinize, that will keep it from sticking together as you're cooking it. It'll give a nice nutty flavor. It's a whole lot healthier. So I don't know if that helps. You did some experiments with cooking of grains, didn't you?
We did, and we found that that whole kernel wheat or whole kernel oats required about 4 to 5 hours to completely cook them. And corn grits, which we like a lot in the South, that requires a good 4 hours of cooking in order to make them about the consistency of mashed potatoes, which is a very fine dish when it's properly prepared, and also a very healthful dish. There are some other reasons or some other things associated with bedwetting that are far more serious. One of those is epilepsy, and of course that's very rare. But if you find that your child's bed is wet and the bed is disheveled quite a lot, more than you think the child usually does with ordinary sleeping, you might just check to see if the child might be having a seizure during the night. Nocturnal seizures are more common probably than we might think they are in children who are going to have epilepsy. Then, of course, it can be associated with diabetes, juvenile diabetes, and you want to check for that if the condition persists or worsens. And then sometimes sleepwalking is associated with bedwetting, and speech disorders of various kinds can also be associated with bedwetting. Not that they're a cause, but just that if your child has some of these other conditions, know that they may have more difficulty when they try to control their continence at night. Cystitis is an important thing in children, especially little boys. Little boys seem to have more cystitis than little girls, although little girls can certainly have it. I remember one little girl who was put with I think her father had either milk goats or milk cows, and they were put in a pasture that did not have a gate. So the little girl was set there to mind the cows in the pen while the older members of the family were doing something else, and she began to notice that she couldn't hold her urine long enough to be able to get ready to pass her urine. So she began to wet her clothing. And after she smelled like urine several days in a row, her mother said, "What's happening with you? Why are you smelling like you have wet yourself?" And she said, "Well, I am. I do wet myself, and I don't know why. I really try." And then the mother realized that she had an incontinence problem due to cystitis. So they began to check, and the doctor found that there were pus cells and bacteria in the urine, and with proper treatment, the young lady was cured within a short time. So this can be an affection of little girls as well, but little boys tend to have it more frequently, and older women. So it's mainly a problem with little boys and older women. Older women because of the short urethra and because of difficulties with back infection from a short urethra and the perineal area. But if a woman is very careful and uses a perineal pour after every voiding, then that will minimize the cystitis problem. In children, often it's due, as it is in bedwetting, to a food sensitivity. These should be checked and eliminated. So you first eliminate all the foods that you're going to test, and when the cystitis has cleared up, the child no longer has the problem, then you start adding the foods back one food at a time until a food starts making the problem again. And at that time you start making a list. Make a list of all those foods that cause the child to have the symptoms. Now the symptoms of cystitis are first urgency and frequency, just like the little girl who was not able to hold her urine until she could get ready to void and would wet her clothing. That urgency is also a hallmark of cystitis. The urgency, the frequency. Sometimes they can't wait more than 10 minutes between voidings, and sometimes the urgency is so great that they are unable to hold the urine until they can get prepared to void. Another thing is pain or burning on urination. And if the pain is at the beginning of the urination, then you suspect that it's the lower part of the urinary tract, the urethra and the neck of the bladder. But if the pain is at the end of urination, when the bladder is contracting, doing its little toilet, which it should do all the time, it should squeeze down at the end of each urination, and that squeezes off any debris that may have accumulated on the lining of the bladder and helps that to be passed from the body. So that little squeezing is a hygienic measure on the part of the bladder to keep itself clean. If at that time, when the squeezing occurs, if that's the time of the pain, then it means that the problem is higher up, which may be interstitial cystitis. Now the interstitial cystitis is certainly a big problem, but that's mainly in adults and not the subject right now. With children, as you find those foods to which they're sensitive and remove them, often that's the end of the problem for them. Lack of proper water drinking is a big issue with cystitis. So if your child frequently has cystitis, then be certain that they drink enough water. How much water? Well, it's still 8 glasses, but it's just 8 child-sized glasses. So a very small child has a little glass. A bigger child has a little bigger glass. And they can simply mark down every time they have a glass of water. They mark it down, and by the time they've gotten their 8 glasses, you know that they are finished. So those two things, getting enough water, being certain that there is no food, and of course the infection matter, being very clean with the child, those can be very helpful. Now another thing that a lot of people don't think about is the use of soap. Soap or bubble bath, those are very common causes of having some kind of cystitis. Wearing panties that are not made of cotton, that can also be a problem. So armed with these bits of information, you should be able to handle this problem quite nicely. Now, another thing that happens in children, it's quite rare, but it might be of interest to know that that dehydration can proceed to the point that it can cause a renal vein thrombosis. If you allow the child to become so dehydrated that the blood pools in the veins that drain the kidneys and return the blood to the heart, then a renal vein thrombosis is certainly a great threat to the health of the child. Fortunately, it's not very common, but long before we have a child capable of making a thrombus in the renal veins, we should be hydrating the child. So if they cannot keep fluid down by mouth, they cannot keep fluid in because of diarrhea, then they still need to have fluids taken. So at that point, you need to get professional assistance and get some IV fluids. Now, another thing that we have in childhood is acute glomerulonephritis. The scene develops in this way. The child has a streptococcal sore throat or a streptococcal infection somewhere else, such as a boil or elsewhere, an infected wound. And the streptococcus does not cause the child to have the glomerulonephritis directly, but after a couple of weeks following the problem with the sore throat or the streptococcal infection, then the glomerulonephritis occurs. Now, the first thing that the parent may see may not be any symptoms in the child. They may just notice that the urine is dark. If this is a child, a very small child, this can be seen on the diaper, but if it's an older child, it may be seen in the commode when they have passed their urine. So at that point, some investigation needs to be made. But they may have pain in the bladder, or they may have pain in the back where the kidneys are. Fever and chills may also occur at that time, and prostration, so that the child is by no means well enough to be up and around. Acute glomerulonephritis is principally characterized by blood and by albumin in the urine. When the child's blood pressure is taken, it's amazing how high the blood pressure can go under these circumstances. The reason for that is that an injured kidney, from whatever reason, will release certain hormones that tend to cause a constriction of blood vessels. It's not all the blood vessels in the body, but principally, in fact, specifically, the small blood vessels of the body, which are mainly composed of muscle. Now, if you will notice this diagram that I'm going to draw on the board, you will see just what kind of artery is involved with this. It's an artery that's of our almost our smallest size. They have the outside wall there, and the inside lumen is very small, and all of this is muscle here. And so the hormone from the kidney is so strong that it makes this muscle contract. And as it gets tighter, then of course the area for blood to be in that small lumen diminishes, and with the reduction in the size of that lumen of the blood vessel, then the blood pressure goes way up. A child may have a blood pressure, a child with acute glomerulonephritis may have a blood pressure that's 350 over 180. It can be enormously high, the highest blood pressures that we ever see. And of course, this must be treated promptly so that the child can resume normal activities. Now, acute glomerulonephritis usually runs its course in about a week or 2 weeks, sometimes 3, and we expect that recovery will be complete, that there will be no residuum whatsoever in the kidney, and the kidney will function entirely normally ever thereafter. But approximately 10% of children with acute glomerulonephritis will proceed to chronic or to a subacute glomerulonephritis. Does not clear in the usual few weeks that we expect acute glomerulonephritis to clear, but will last a number of weeks or a number of months longer with blood in the urine and protein in the urine, so that the child still may have some symptoms, but usually the symptoms are only the sign of the blood or the protein in the urine. May not be a lot of blood, but may be enough so that the parent can see it in the commode. About 10% of those that go into that phase will go into a chronic phase. So you expect that almost, well, more than 90%, maybe 95, 98% of children with acute glomerulonephritis will clear up, but a certain percentage will go on to a chronic form of glomerulonephritis, which is progressive, and the glomeruli, which are the functioning units of the kidney, they begin to constrict and to scar down and die. And when the little patient has lost enough of the little nephrons in the kidneys, then the kidneys cease to function, and we have a kidney failure. In these children now, we have the capability of giving them some very good relief by getting a kidney for them, and we can often relieve their problem if they have complete kidney failure by a kidney transplant. This is a very good treatment for them, and they are very good candidates. They often do quite well with that. Now, another form of congenital problem is that of polycystic disease of the kidneys. You may have heard of this. It's not too rare. You may know a person who is in their 30s or 40s who has a kidney problem, and if you inquire, they tell you it's polycystic kidney. What happens here is that the connection between the little glomerulus and the little tubule that drains the urine produced in the glomerular apparatus, that little tube, they do not match up exactly in a lot of cases. And what causes this can be multitudinous. It can be something in the prenatal time, when the mother may have become intoxicated with fumes or with some kind of food or some other kind of difficulty, or it may be entirely a genetic problem. At any rate, these cysts begin to grow, and by the time the person is 40 to 50, they are really quite large and sometimes do induce a complete kidney failure. Now, we have not covered the entire gamut of genitourinary problems in children, but we have covered a few of them so that you can maybe understand the importance of the kidneys and keeping them in very good health. May the Lord bless you with good health in this way.